The coffee in Ethan Cole's hand had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He knew this because he'd made it at 6:14 a.m., right after the alarm, the one he set but never actually needed because he'd been awake since 4:50, lying in the dark of his penthouse bedroom with Vivian's hair fanned across the pillow beside him, her breathing slow and even, her hand resting open near his arm in the practiced way of someone who had learned that proximity without quite touching felt more intimate than actual contact. He'd watched the ceiling. He'd calculated things. He did this most mornings now, in the gray hour before the city fully woke, running figures in his head the way other men ran miles, compulsively, without joy, searching for something that didn't add up. The coffee sat on the kitchen island now. Grayed down. A ring of condensation had formed beneath the mug, a perfect circle on the black stone surface. Ethan was at the window. 41 floors down, the city was doing what it always did at 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, moving with the mechanical urgency of something that had never learned to rest. Delivery trucks, a woman in a yellow coat walking fast, a cluster of pigeons disbanding from a ledge across the street like a thought, breaking apart before it fully formed. He pressed one finger to the glass. Cold. The kind of cold that seeps through double-paned glass in October and still finds you. He thought about the wire transfer, not the one Vivian knew about, the one she didn't. The $2.3 million that had moved through her personal account 6 weeks ago, the one she'd explained as a freelance consulting fee from a firm in Geneva, which Ethan had nodded at because he was good at nodding. He was excellent at nodding. In the 14 months they'd been together, he'd developed nodding into an art form, the slight tilt of the head, the small sound of acceptance, the eyes that said, "I hear you," while the mind behind them was already 3 moves ahead, pulling threads, cross-referencing, building the kind of invisible architecture that his profession had taught him to build without leaving fingerprints. Ethan Cole was a financial forensics specialist. He'd spent 11 years tracing money. He knew how it moved. See, where it hid, what it looked like when someone tried to make it disappear, and what it looked like when someone tried to make its origins unreadable. He could look at a wire transfer and feel, in a way he couldn't fully articulate to civilians, whether the route was clean or constructed. It was like a sommelier tasting the terroir in a glass of wine, a kind of knowledge that lived below language. The Geneva transfer had a particular quality to it. He hadn't said anything. He'd nodded. He picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway, which was a habit his father had drilled into him as a child. Waste nothing, feel nothing about the waste, move on. His father had been a meticulous man. His father had also been a man who'd trusted the wrong people and died leaving debts that took Ethan 7 years to pay off, which was perhaps the most formative educational experience of his life, more than any degree or any case. The bedroom door opened behind him. Vivian moved through the apartment the way she always did, with an unconscious elegance that seemed genuinely effortless, the kind that only comes from years of practice so deep it's become involuntary. She was wearing his gray dress shirt, unbuttoned to mid-chest, and she had that morning expression on her face. Soft, slightly unguarded, the version of herself she'd calibrated as the most disarming. "You're up early," she said. "Wanpan. I'm always up early." "You're brooding early." She came to stand beside him at the window. He could smell her, last night's perfume and something warmer underneath, sleep and skin. She looked down at the street. "What are you thinking about?" "Work," he said. She leaned slightly into him. "Geneva client?" He said nothing. She took his silence as the comfortable silence of a man who didn't want to talk shop before 7 a.m., which was, on the surface, a reasonable interpretation. "I have that thing with Dominic tonight," she said. "The gallery opening. You said you might come." "I'll try." "It's fine if you can't." She touched his arm lightly. "I know you're slammed." He watched a pigeon land on the ledge across the street, watched it walk a few steps, stop, reconsider, walk back. "I'll try," he said again. She smiled. He could see it in her reflection in the glass. And then she moved toward the kitchen. He heard the sound of the coffee machine beginning its cycle. Thud, the hiss of water, the low mechanical grind. He turned back to the street. The pigeon was gone. He was still standing there when his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it. Marcus. He picked it up. His brother called rarely. Marcus was 3 years younger, lived in Portland now, worked in environmental consulting, existed in Ethan's life as a comfortable presence at Thanksgiving, and the occasional late-night call when one of them was having a bad week. They weren't close in the performative way that some brothers were, but they were close in the structural way, the way load-bearing walls are close, quietly holding something up. He answered. "It's 6:30, Ethan said. "I know." Marcus's voice was wrong. Not panicked, something else. Tight, like a man who'd been rehearsing what to say for a long time, and was now saying it, and finding that the rehearsal hadn't been enough. "I need to see you. Today. Not at the office. Not anywhere you usually go. Somewhere quiet." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Marcus? I know how this sounds. Tell me how it sounds." A pause. In the kitchen, the coffee machine finished its cycle. Vivian was humming something low. "It sounds like someone who needs to tell his brother something that changes everything," Marcus said, "and who needs to do it in person. Just, can you do that? Lunch, I'll come to you. Name somewhere you don't usually go." Ethan thought for a moment. "The Meridian on 54th, he said. "It's a hotel bar. Nobody I know goes there." "Noon. Noon." The call ended. Ethan set the phone down. Vivian came around the island with 2 cups of fresh coffee, set one in front of him, and kissed him once, briefly, on the cheek. The kind of kiss that was so practiced it had become invisible. "Better?" she said, nodding at the new cup. "Yes," he said. He didn't pick it up. The Meridian's bar was everything Ethan had described, the kind of place that existed in the middle distance of the city's social geography, frequented by out-of-town businessmen and the occasional afternoon drinker who valued anonymity over ambiance. Low lighting, booths with high backs, a bartender who had the specific quality of someone who had been doing this long enough to have developed professional invisibility. Tintuan, the kind of place where a conversation could happen without becoming a story someone told later. Marcus was already there when Ethan arrived at 12:03. He looked at first glance the way he always did, the same lean frame, the same dark hair that had a slight wave to it at the temples, the same quality of stillness that had always defined him, a kind of settled presence in his own body that Ethan had sometimes envied. But something was wrong. Not dramatically. Nothing that would have registered if you didn't know him. The line of his jaw was too tight. His hands, wrapped around a glass of water, were completely still in the way that hands are still only when the person is working very hard to make them still. Ethan slid into the booth across from him. They looked at each other. "You look terrible," Ethan said. "I know." "When did you get in?" "This morning, 5 a.m. flight." Marcus set the glass down, picked it up, set it down again. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. Since I found out." Ethan said nothing. He waited. He was good at waiting. Marcus exhaled. A long, controlled breath, the kind a diver takes before going under. Then he looked directly at Ethan, and when he spoke, his voice had that quality Ethan recognized from the phone call. Tightly controlled, stripped of anything extraneous, built for information delivery. "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is real," Marcus said. I know how this is going to sound. I need you to hear it anyway and make your own decisions." "Marcus." "Just let me say it, and then you can call me crazy. Just let me say it first." Ethan opened his hands on the table. A gesture of permission. Marcus said, "I know what happens. I know what she does. I know the specific dates, the account numbers, the names of the lawyers she uses, and the exact mechanism by which she will destroy you if you let her. I know this because I watched it happen. I was there. 3 years from now, I'm sitting in a bar just like this one, watching my brother's entire professional life get dismantled in a federal civil proceeding. And I am thinking, if I could just go back, if I could just tell him." Ethan looked at him. "Go back," he said. "Yes." The word sat between them on the table like a weight. "You're telling me," Ethan said, "very carefully, that you traveled back in time." Marcus didn't flinch. "I'm telling you that I have knowledge of specific future events. I'm not asking you to believe the mechanism. I'm asking you to verify the information." "How?" "Because I'm going to tell you things about her that you can check right now. Not in a year. Right now. Today." He reached into his jacket and put a folded piece of paper on the table. "That's the account number for a Luxembourg holding registered under a trust named Aldercroft Meridian Holdings. She set it up 14 months ago, 5 weeks before you started dating. The beneficial owner is listed as a third-party LLC incorporated in the Cayman Islands, but if you drill 2 layers down into the LLC structure, you'll find a director named Cosimo Fenwick. Cosimo Fenwick is the older brother of Dominic Ashford." Ethan went still. Not outwardly. Outwardly, he was exactly the same, a composed man in a dark coat sitting across from his brother in a hotel bar. But inside, something had moved. Something that had been balanced on an edge had shifted its weight. Dominic Ashford, the gallery opening. Tonight. The name Vivian had mentioned this morning with the careful casualness of someone who had practiced saying it without inflection. "Dominic," Ethan said, "is her cousin." "He is not her cousin," Marcus said. "They've maintained that story because it explains the contact, the calls, the meetings. Dominic Ashford is her business partner, has been for 11 years. They met at the London School of Economics. The cousin story goes back to her time in New York, when she needed a socially acceptable explanation for the frequency of contact." He tapped the paper. "Check the account. Check Fenwick. It takes maybe 45 minutes if you know what you're doing. And you know what you're doing." Ethan looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. "What's the play?" he said. Marcus blinked. "What?" "The play. What are they actually after?" Because Ethan had been in this business long enough to know that the account, the cover story, the carefully constructed relationship, none of that was an end in itself. That was scaffolding. "What's the target?" Marcus looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read, something between relief and a deeper, older sadness. The sadness of someone who had watched something happen and had not been able to stop it, and was now watching it again from a different angle. "Your grandfather's trust," Marcus said. "The Coalwood Irrevocable. The one Dad's estate lawyer set up in 2004 that you and I are co-beneficiaries of. She found out about it 8 months into the relationship. Your tax preparer, a man named Holloway, was having financial difficulties. She paid him for the documentation. The trust pays out at 2 specific trigger events: the death of the surviving trustee, which is Uncle Gerald, who is 81 years old and currently in declining health, or a qualified marriage event, which is defined in the trust language as a legal marriage between a co-beneficiary and a person who has resided with or been legally partnered to the beneficiary for a period of not less than 2 years. Ethan didn't move. "The payout," Marcus said. "If Uncle Gerald dies before the marriage trigger is split equally between you and me. The trust holds approximately $14 million in diversified assets, plus the Lake Tahoe property, which is currently appraised at 4.2. If the marriage trigger fires first, the trust allows the co-beneficiary spouse to receive a preferential distribution." He paused. In the original 2004 language, that preferential distribution is 40% of the total trust value. To the spouse, Ethan said. To the spouse. Silence. And after the marriage trigger fires, Ethan said, and the preferential distribution is made, what was the plan? She would file for divorce 18 months later, citing irreconcilable differences. Dominic's legal team would be handling the divorce proceedings. Under New York equitable distribution law, she would have grounds to claim a percentage of income earned during the marriage, including any business proceeds. But more importantly, the marriage trigger would already have fired. The trust distribution would already have been made. The $14 million would already be in the Aldercroft account, routed through Fenwick, moved within 72 hours to a structure she controls. The divorce would be a formality at that point. The real extraction would already be complete. Ethan sat with this. He was a man who had spent 11 years inside other people's financial crimes. He knew how this worked. He knew the patience it required. He knew the specific kind of intelligence, cold, sustained, architecturally precise, that was required to build a play like this and run it for years without breaking character. He also knew, sitting here, in this low-lit bar with his brother's careful voice still in the air between them, that he had felt it. Not this specifically, not the account numbers, not Fenwick, not the trust language, but the shape of it, the texture. He'd felt it in the Geneva transfer and had been ignoring what he felt, which was not something Ethan Cole typically did, but which apparently was something he was capable of doing when the woman smelled like sleep and perfume and handed him coffee in the morning. He picked up the paper. He looked at the account number. He put it in his inside pocket. "All right," he said. Marcus stared at him. "All right? I'll verify it." He reached for his water glass. "If it checks out, I'll handle it." "Ethan?" Marcus's voice had dropped. "I watched this happen. I watched you lose the trust, the property, the firm's reputation, because she used the Holloway documents in the divorce discovery process, and it looked like you'd known about certain trust provisions and hadn't disclosed them to a client. I watched you spend 2 years in a legal proceeding that cost you everything and ended with you still having your license, but nothing else." He stopped. "I am sitting in a bar in 2027, watching my brother rebuild from zero at 44 years old, and I am thinking, why didn't someone tell him? Why didn't I just tell him?" Ethan looked at him. "So you're telling me," he said. "Yes. And I'm listening." A pause. "You're very calm," Marcus said. "I'm always calm. You don't have questions about how I have exactly one question about the mechanism," Ethan said. "And it's not one you can answer in a way that I could verify, so asking it serves no purpose. The information is either accurate or it isn't. I'll know within an hour." He set the glass down. "The rest of it, the how, is yours to carry. I'm not going to make you explain something that doesn't have a framework I can use." Marcus stared at him for a long moment. "She's going to be at that gallery tonight," Marcus said. "With Dominic. That's not a coincidence. Uncle Gerald had a procedure last week. His cardiologist gave him 6 to 18 months. She knows. Dominic knows. They're accelerating." Ethan nodded slowly. "The timeline for the marriage proposal. When? In your version? 3 weeks from now. She was going to propose the idea to you. Not him. She was going to make you think it was your idea. She was going to tell you she'd been thinking about children, that she felt ready. She was going to create a context in which proposing felt like it was coming from you organically." "How?" "She'd already stopped her birth control 6 weeks ago. The plan was a pregnancy scare, managed, timed, followed by a conversation about the future that she would steer." Something moved through Ethan's expression so quickly, it was barely there. Then it was gone. He looked at his watch, stood up. "I'll call you tonight," he said. "Ethan, tonight." He looked at his brother. "Thank you." Marcus said nothing. He looked like a man who had rehearsed this conversation as a crisis and found himself in something quieter and stranger than a crisis, something more like surgery, precise. Bloodless on the surface. Ethan left. He was in the back of a car heading downtown by 12:41 p.m. His phone was in his hand. He had a contact, a woman named Petra Voss, who worked in the International Accounts Division of a compliance consulting firm and who had been a useful professional resource for 11 years. The kind of person who knew how to pull international corporate registry documents from multiple jurisdictions and assemble them into coherent structures without asking unnecessary questions. He texted her the account number Marcus had written down. Beneath it, he wrote, "Beneficial ownership chain, full structure, Luxembourg to Cayman, priority." He added, "Also Cosimo Fenwick, corporate directorships across all jurisdictions last 5 years." He put the phone face down on his knee and looked out the window. The city moved past, a blur of storefronts, pedestrians, scaffolding wrapped around a building being renovated, a woman arguing into a phone on the corner of 48th, with the fierce concentration of someone who had given up on anyone around her noticing. A food cart, steam rising from a grate. He thought about Vivian's hand on his arm this morning. He was clinical about this. He allowed himself to be clinical about this, because the alternative was a door he simply wasn't going to open, not now, possibly not for a long time, possibly not at all, which was a choice he made in the same way he made all his choices, deliberately, with full awareness of what he was not doing, with the cold recognition that grief, however legitimate, was not currently useful. Vivian Ashford was an extraordinarily well-constructed position. The relationship had been initiated in a context, a charity dinner in March of last year, that he now realized he should have examined more carefully. He'd assumed the encounter was random because it had the texture of random. She'd been with a friend, a woman named Greta who seemed genuinely peripheral, a social prop. They'd been placed at adjacent tables. At her, Vivian had leaned across to borrow a pen, a physical gesture so small and anachronistic that it had registered as charming rather than staged. He thought now about the pen. He thought about the specific kind of intelligence required to know that a financial forensics specialist, a man who had spent his career studying the way people constructed lies, would be disarmed more easily by something that seemed too small to be a calculated move. He took the phone off his knee. He had a secondary contact, a man named Theodore Raines who practiced estate and trust law and who had been, years ago, the associate who'd handled some of the ancillary documentation on the Coalwood Irrevocable. Ethan had referred clients to him over the years. Theodore owed him, in the loose professional currency of reciprocal goodwill. He called. "Theo." "Ethan." Unexpected. "I need a trust review, confidential. Today, if possible." A pause. "Which trust?" "Coalwood Irrevocable. My grandfather's 2004 instrument. I need a full reading of the distribution trigger language, specifically the qualified marriage event provision, the defined terms around spousal preferential distribution, and any ambiguity in the residency versus legal partnership language." Another pause. Longer. "That's a narrow ask," Theodore said carefully. "Surpond. Something I should know about?" "I need to understand the exact legal definition of what constitutes a qualified marriage event under that instrument, and I need to know if there are any defensive amendments that can be made before that trigger fires." "Defensive amendments to an irrevocable trust are narrow. I know. I'm asking if there's room." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "Come in at 3. I'll pull the document." 3, Ethan confirmed. He ended the call. The car was approaching his building. He had 2 hours and 19 minutes before the meeting with Theodore. He spent the ride thinking about the structure Marcus had described, not emotionally, but architecturally, the way he approached any case. He turned it over. examined the load-bearing points, looked for the places where the construction was vulnerable. There were several. The fact that the extraction depended on the marriage trigger firing meant that as long as the trigger didn't fire, the play collapsed. This was the simplest intervention and also, under the circumstances, the most straightforward. But Ethan was not a man who left single points of failure standing. If the primary play failed, what was the contingency? He didn't know yet. He needed to know. Which meant he needed to understand what Vivian's position would look like if he ended the relationship without explanation before the gallery tonight. He also needed to know about Holloway, the tax preparer, the man who had presumably sold his client's private financial documentation to a third party, which was, depending on the specifics, a violation of state professional licensing statutes, potentially actionable under federal privacy provisions, and absolutely grounds for a complaint to the IRS Office of Professional Responsibility that would result in the permanent revocation of his PTIN. Ethan would come back to Holloway. He went up to his office, a private suite on the 38th floor of a building on Lexington, 4 employees, a whitened glass space that felt like the inside of a focused mind. His assistant, a composed young woman named Sienna, looked up when he came in. "Cancel everything this afternoon except the 3 o'clock, he said. "Tell anyone who calls that I'm in depositions." She nodded without question. He went into his office, closed the door, sat down at his desk. Petra responded at 1:17 p.m. Her message was structured in the efficient, clinical shorthand of someone who had been doing this for a long time. Aldercroft Meridian Holdings, Luxembourg Private Foundation established 22 months ago, beneficial ownership traced through 2 layers, Cayman LLC, Fenwick Island Partners Limited, to individual beneficial owner via a professional nominee structure. BO identified on Cayman Registry as Cosimo Fenwick, DOB 1978, UK National. Corporate directorships. Fenwick holds 19 directorships across 6 jurisdictions, cross-referencing Ashford, 1 shared directorship found, a dormant UK company called Greywell Consult Limited, incorporated 2013, annual filings consistently maintained. Directors, Cosimo Fenwick and Vivian Margot Ashford. Ethan read this twice. He thought about Marcus saying, "Dominic Ashford is her business partner, has been for 11 years. If Vivian Ashford and Cosimo Fenwick, the brother of Dominic Ashford, shared a corporate directorship going back 12 years, then Vivian and the Ashford family were not cousins in any colloquial sense. They were collaborators in the formal, documented, company-registered sense." He wrote back to Petra. "Greywell Consult, all filings since inception. Any transactions, bank accounts listed, or connected entities." He paused, then added, "And find me anything public on Dominic Ashford, specifically any legal proceedings, civil or otherwise, in the UK or US. He stood up, moved to the window. This was becoming a pattern, he noted with a distant clinical amusement, moving to windows when the city needed to absorb something. He looked at the street 40 floors down. The same mechanical urgency as always. People who didn't know that the ground under them was full of channels and routes and transactions they'd never see. He was thinking about the trust. The Colwood Irrevocable Trust had been set up by his grandfather, Walter Cole, in 2004, 2 years before his death, and managed since then by the family's designated trustee, Gerald Cole, Walter's brother, and the last of that generation. The trust had been a relatively straightforward wealth preservation instrument at inception. But the distribution trigger language, specifically the marriage provision, had been a point of personal sentiment for his grandfather, who had believed, in the particular way of men from that era, that the proper occasion for wealth to pass to the next generation was the formation of a family. The provision had seemed slightly quaint when Ethan had reviewed the trust documents years ago. He had not examined it closely. So, because he had no expectation of marrying anytime soon, and the primary payout mechanism, Gerald's death, remained hypothetical. It did not feel hypothetical now. He needed to know if the instrument could be modified. Irrevocable trusts were, by definition, resistant to modification, but irrevocable was a legal term of art, not a physical wall. There were mechanisms, specifically decanting, judicial modification under EPTL Section 1, 0-6.6, and in certain circumstances the use of a non-judicial settlement agreement if all interested parties could be assembled and agreed. He and Marcus were co-beneficiaries. Gerald was the trustee. If all three could agree to a modification, specifically a modification that either removed the marriage trigger provision or restructured the spousal preferential distribution language, the vulnerability disappeared. The question was whether Gerald would agree in time. Gerald was 81. Gerald was in declining health. Gerald was also, from Ethan's memory of him, a man of principle and stubbornness in roughly equal measure, which meant the conversation would need to be managed carefully. He called Marcus. "I've verified the account," he said when Marcus answered. "Fenwick, the Ashford connection, the Luxembourg structure, and it's real. All of it." On the other end of the line, Marcus breathed out, a long, slow exhalation that contained what sounded like 14 months of tension finally finding somewhere to go. "Okay," he said. "Okay. I need you to stay in New York. Don't go back to Portland yet. And I need you to call Gerald." "Uncle Gerald?" "Yes, tell him you want to come visit. Make it about his health. That part's real, so it won't read as strange. Set up the visit for this weekend. Don't tell him what it's about yet." "And what do I tell him it's about when I'm there?" "I'll be there too. We'll both be there. I'm going to have a conversation with Gerald about the trust, and I need both co-beneficiaries present for any modification to be valid." A pause. "You're going to modify the trust," Marcus said. "I'm going to try." "What about Vivian? What are you going to—" "Tonight," Ethan said. "I'm handling tonight. He hung up. At 3:02 p.m., Ethan sat across from Theodore Raines in a corner office that smelled of old books and good coffee, the real kind, dark and slightly bitter, served in proper cups. Theodore was 63, white-haired, with the kind of face that had settled into its final form years ago and simply waited there, measured, lined, professionally neutral. He had the trust document spread across the desk between them. "All right," Theodore said. "I've read it through. You want the marriage trigger language. I want all of it, but start there." Theodore turned to a marked page. Section 7B, Qualified Marriage Event. The instrument defines this as, and I'm reading verbatim, a legal marriage ceremony between a co-beneficiary of this trust and any individual who has, at the date of the marriage ceremony, maintained a primary residential relationship or formal domestic partnership with the co-beneficiary for a period of not less than 24 consecutive months, with such period measured from the most recent date of established cohabitation. Ethan absorbed this. 24 months, he said. 24 months of cohabitation or domestic partnership. Theodore looked at him over the document. "How long has she been living with you?" "She hasn't?" Theodore raised an eyebrow. "She has her own apartment," Ethan said. "Upper West Side. She's here, at my place, 5-6 nights a week. Has been for approximately the last 8 months. But she has maintained her own lease. Her address of record is not my address." Theodore was quiet for a moment. "The instrument says primary residential relationship," he said. "That language is ambiguous. It would be possible, in a proceeding, to argue that consistent cohabitation of 5 or 6 nights per week over 8 months could constitute a primary residential relationship, even without formal change of address. He paused. However, at 8 months, even if that argument succeeded, you are 16 months short of the 24-month threshold. If the relationship ends tonight, Ethan said, the clock stops. The clock stops, Theodore confirmed. More than that, the clock resets. Though she would have to begin the cohabitation period again from zero with any future attempt. And since the qualified marriage event requires the cohabitation to be with a co-beneficiary of this specific trust, he spread his hands. There's no future attempt, Ethan said. Correct. Ethan looked at the document. Now tell me about modification. Theodore laced his fingers together. What specifically are you hoping to achieve? I want the spousal preferential distribution provision removed. Or alternatively, I want the qualified marriage event trigger restructured so that the cohabitation period is extended, or the trigger is eliminated entirely, and the only remaining distribution mechanism is the trustee succession event. Removing a distribution provision from an irrevocable trust. Theodore exhaled through his nose. Under New York EPTL, you have 3 viable paths. First, judicial modification. Petition to the surrogate's court demonstrating that the modified trust better fulfills the settler's original intent. That takes time. 6 to 12 months minimum. Second, decanting. If the trust instrument permits it, the trustee can distribute assets to a new trust with modified terms. I'd need to look at the specific powers granted to the trustee here. He scanned the document. Section 12. Trustee powers. Yes. There's a decanting authorization. Tabon. Somewhat broadly written. Gerald has the power to distribute assets to a successor trust. Whether that successor trust could simply omit the marriage trigger provision is arguable. Arguable in my favor? With the right language, possibly. Third option, NJSA, non-judicial settlement agreement. All interested parties consent in writing to the modification. That's you, your brother, Gerald, as trustee, and technically any remainder beneficiaries. He looked at the document again. Remainder beneficiaries if no qualified marriage event occurs, and Gerald predeceases both co-beneficiaries. That's your grandmother's charitable foundation. He looked up. The foundation is inactive, I assume? My grandmother died in 2019. The foundation hasn't been operational since. If it's formally dissolved or dormant with no successor trustee, it may be possible to proceed without that party's consent. I'd need to confirm the foundation's current legal status. He leaned back. If the NJSA path is viable and all living interested parties consent, you, Marcus, Gerald, we can have a modification executed and filed within 2 weeks. Can we do it in 5 days? Theodore looked at him. Gerald's health, Ethan said. I need this done while he's still capable of giving valid consent. Theodore held his gaze for a moment. Get Gerald in front of a notary with a physician's attestation of mental capacity, and yes, 5 days is achievable. Ethan stood. Draft the NJSA, he said. I'll have Gerald and Marcus available this weekend. You understand? Theodore said carefully. That if there's any suggestion of undue influence in the modification. There won't be, Ethan said. Gerald will be acting voluntarily, with full information, on the advice of independent counsel. I'll arrange independent counsel for him separately. He buttoned his coat. The modification is in his interest and Marcus's interest as much as mine. So, he'll understand that. He picked up his briefcase. One more thing, he said. The original distribution schedule. If the marriage trigger is removed and Gerald's succession event becomes the only mechanism, the split remains 50-50 between Marcus and me. That's what the instrument says in the absence of the qualified marriage provision, yes. Ethan nodded once. He left. His phone buzzed in the elevator. Petra again. Graywell consult filings attached. See particularly the 2019 accounts. Company received a consulting fee of £340,000 from a UK-based entity called Arden Capital Management. Arden Capital is a UK FCA-registered fund with a single institutional investor. Single investor identified through public filings as Ashford Private Equity Holdings Limited. Director of Ashford PEH, Dominic Richard Ashford. Ethan read this in the elevator on the way down. So the structure was: Dominic Ashford was the source of the capital. Cosimo Fenwick was the operational layer, the director of record, the nominee, the name on the filings. Vivian was the interface, the human contact, the positioned asset. The money moved from Dominic through legitimate-seeming corporate structures to Fenwick, to Graywell, to Vivian. Clean on the surface, traceable only if you knew to look. He knew to look. He forwarded Petra's message to a second email address, one maintained under a pseudonym, on a server he controlled, that he used for case documentation. Then he took a photograph of Marcus's handwritten note with the account number and added it to the same folder. He was building a file. He did this the way he built all files, methodically, with the understanding that documentation was a weapon, and the time to assemble a weapon was before you needed it, not during. He thought, briefly, about Holloway, the tax preparer, the man who had sold his clients private financial documents. That was the original sin in this whole architecture, the point of entry. Without Holloway, Vivian wouldn't have known about the trust's specific trigger language. She might have known the trust existed. That was findable in probate records, theoretically. But the specific spousal preferential distribution provision was not public information. It was in the private instrument held by the trustee. Holloway had provided a copy, presumably. A man who had sold privileged client documents was not a man who would be difficult to pressure. Ethan filed this away for later. He stepped out of the elevator into the lobby. The doorman held the door. Outside, the October air hit him, cold and clean, with the particular quality of late afternoon in autumn that felt like a reset, like a breath the city was taking. The light was going gold on the upper floors of the buildings across the street. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He thought about the gallery. He thought about Vivian standing in his kitchen this morning, handing him coffee, her hair loose, her feet bare on the floor, her expression so carefully calibrated to softness that he'd spent 8 months looking at it without fully registering the calibration. He thought about 22 months ago, the specific month in which Marcus had said Aldercroft Meridian Holdings was established, 2 months before the charity dinner, 2 months before the pen. He thought about the specific kind of patience that required. He hailed a cab. He had 4 hours before the gallery. He used the 4 hours. He called Marcus and told him to book a flight to Philadelphia for Thursday. Gerald lived in Chestnut Hill, in the house he'd occupied for 40 years. Marcus said he'd already looked up flights, that he'd been prepared to do this, which Ethan noted with a quiet approval. He called Theodore's office and confirmed the draft NJSA would be ready by Friday. He drafted a letter, brief, clinical, documented in a way that any future legal review would find impeccable, to the IRS Office of Professional Responsibility regarding one Harold Holloway, enrolled agent regarding a potential violation of Circular 230 involving the unauthorized disclosure of client financial documents. He did not send it yet. He saved it as a draft and noted the date on the file. He reviewed the Graywell filings Petra had sent and found, in the 2021 accounts, an entry he'd missed on first read, a loan from Graywell Consult to an individual, documented as a director's loan, of £180,000. The loan was listed as outstanding. The director was Vivian Ashford. He added this to the file. He thought about what Marcus had said, the mechanism of the divorce plan, the 18-month window after the marriage trigger fired, the Dominic-controlled legal team. He thought about equitable distribution. He thought about the fact that, under New York law, equitable distribution of marital assets in a proceeding brought by a financially sophisticated party with documentation of both parties' resources, would be a complex, extended, expensive proceeding even in the absence of any fraud. He thought about what it would look like to be on the receiving end of that proceeding, armed with the documentation he was building. He thought about Dominic Ashford's position as the sole institutional investor in Arden Capital, Sions, which was an FCA-registered fund in the UK. FCA registration meant regulatory oversight. Regulatory oversight meant that any finding of fraud in a U.S. civil proceeding involving an Arden-affiliated entity would be reportable to the FCA, which would trigger an investigation, which would put Dominic's fund status at risk. He noted this. He also noted that Aldercroft Meridian Holdings in Luxembourg operated under the supervision of the Commission de Surveillance du Secteur Financier, the CSSF. A CSSF-registered private foundation had specific beneficial ownership disclosure obligations under Luxembourg's AML legislation. If the beneficial ownership structure was obscured through the Fenwick nominee arrangement in a way that didn't meet disclosure obligations, that was a potential AML compliance issue in a jurisdiction that took AML compliance very seriously. He added this to the file. By 6:45 p.m., he had a file that he printed to 12 pages, had Sienna scan and encrypt, and stored in 3 separate locations: a physical copy in his office safe, an encrypted digital copy on his server, and a duplicate sent to a sealed email address with instructions to forward to his attorney in the event of certain specified triggers. He put on his coat. He went to the gallery. The gallery was in Chelsea, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick and unfinished concrete floors, the kind of place that made a deliberate aesthetic of incompleteness. The art on the walls was large-format photography, mostly urban, blurred figures in motion, wet streets, the geometry of bridges at night. The crowd was exactly what these crowds always were, a mixture of people who were there for the art, people who were there to be seen, and people who were there because Vivian or Dominic or someone in that orbit had made a call and told them to be there. Ethan got there at 7, which was the exact time Vivian had said the thing started, and therefore probably 40 minutes after she'd arrived. He walked in, took a glass of red wine from a passing tray, and spent 90 seconds scanning the room in the way he always did, methodically, left to right, without appearing to do so. He found her in the back half of the space. She was standing with a group of 4 people, animated, laughing at something. Blonde-braid, wearing a dress the color of deep water, a dark teal that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. She looked, as she always did, exactly right for the context. It was one of the things he'd noticed about her early on, which he'd catalogued at the time as social intelligence, and was now recataloguing as something more specific: the professional skill of reading an environment and becoming within it exactly what the environment suggested a desirable person should be. Standing to her left, slightly angled toward her in the way of someone who had long practice at appearing peripheral, was a man Ethan hadn't met but now recognized from the Greywell filing, from the director photos attached to the UK Companies House records that Petra had included. Slightly taller than average, dark-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had grown up with money and had learned to wear it invisibly. Dominic Ashford, not Vivian's cousin, her partner, her collaborator. The man whose money was in the foundation, whose brother was the nominee, whose legal team was presumably already on standby. Ethan watched them for approximately 30 seconds without moving from his position. Then Vivian saw him. Her face did something. He watched it do it, a brief, almost imperceptible reorganization, a shift from whatever the previous expression had been into the specific arrangement she used for him. Warm, pleased, slightly surprised. She raised her hand in a small wave. He lifted his glass slightly in acknowledgement. He moved toward her. "You came," she said when he reached the group. She touched his arm, the same gesture as this morning. "I'm glad." She turned to the group. "Everyone, This is Ethan. She made brief introductions. 2 names he immediately forgot, a woman who represented the photographer, and then, "And Dominic, my cousin." "Dominic?" Ethan said. Dominic Ashford put out his hand. Ethan shook it. Dominic's grip was measured, practiced, the grip of a man who had shaken a great many hands professionally and calibrated each one. He met Ethan's eyes for 1 second, and then moved them away with the smooth efficiency of someone managing a complex room. "Vivian speaks highly of you," Dominic said. "She's generous," Ethan said. Vivian was watching him. He could feel it, a slight shift in her quality of attention. The faint, almost undetectable tension of a person who was monitoring a variable. He said nothing about the art. He asked the photographer's representative about the exhibition, where it had shown before, what the print run was, whether there were catalog editions available. He asked the kind of questions that established him as a person who was present in the conversation, and not particularly remarkable. He drank his wine slowly. After 20 minutes, Vivian touched his arm again. "Yum. Can I steal you for a moment?" she said with a small smile for the group that communicated, "He's impossible to take anywhere." They moved toward a quieter corner, near a large print of a highway overpass at dusk. The geometry of concrete, the vanishing point of the road, a single pair of headlights blurred by motion. "I didn't expect you to actually come," she said. Her voice had changed, not dramatically, but the performance layer had thinned, the way it always did when they were alone. He'd taken this for intimacy previously. He now understood it as a different mode of operation. "I had a free evening," he said. "You're never free." She looked at him. The particular gaze she had, direct and warm and professionally calibrated to feel like the kind of attention that made a person feel chosen. "You okay? You seem—" "I'm fine." He looked at the photograph. The highway. The vanishing point. "How do you know Dominic, actually? You've mentioned he's your cousin. On which side?" A very small pause. "My mother's side," she said. "Distantly. His mother and mine were—" "What does he do?" "He's in finance, private equity." "Based where?" "London, mostly." She was watching him now with that slightly sharpened quality of attention. "Why the sudden interest in Dominic?" "Just making conversation," Ethan said. "I should circulate." He turned and looked at her. "I'm going to head out soon." Early morning." "Oh." The reorganization again. Almost invisible. "Of course. I'll probably stay a bit longer. Dominic wants to grab dinner after." "Enjoy." He leaned in and kissed her briefly on the cheek. He could smell her perfume. The same one from this morning. The same one from every morning. A detail that had always seemed like continuity and now seemed like a costume. "I'll call you tomorrow." "Okay," she said. He moved through the room, stopped to exchange 2 brief, unremarkable pleasantries with people he barely knew, set his empty glass down on a passing tray. He walked out. The October air received him. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking at the Chelsea Street. The lights of the gallery behind him, a group of people arriving, the sound of a cab slowing. He had said nothing to her, no accusation, no revelation, no dramatic exit. He had simply left. Because the exit wasn't the strategy. The exit was the smallest part of the strategy. He called Marcus from the cab. "Done," he said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Done how?" "I went to the gallery. I saw Dominic. I left." He looked out the window. "She doesn't know anything has changed." "And that's exactly right." He kept his voice level. "She needs to not know anything has changed for approximately the next 8 to 10 days, while the trust modification moves through execution. If she suspects the relationship is ending, or she may try to accelerate the cohabitation argument push to formalize residency, make the case that the 24-month threshold is closer than it is. The last thing I need is a contested cohabitation claim filed in family court while the NJSA is still in process. Marcus was quiet. So you're going to keep seeing her? His voice had a carefully neutral quality. I'm going to maintain the surface of the relationship for 8 to 10 days. Controlled contact. No escalation on either side. While I complete the trust modification, build the documentation file, and arrange what I need to arrange for Holloway. Holloway. The tax preparer. He disclosed privileged client documents. I have a draft complaint to the OPR. I'll hold it until the trust modification is complete. At that point, I'll file it. Holloway will lose his PTIN. He will likely face civil liability to me as his client. I'm not the injured party I'd most want to be in that suit, but I can file as a private citizen whose documents were disclosed and cause him significant professional and financial difficulty. And Vivian? Ethan looked at the city moving past. Vivian will be fine. She has the Aldercroft account, she has Dominic. She has 14 other positions she's presumably running that I don't know about. The play she had against me will fail. The trust will be restructured before the trigger can ever fire. The relationship will end cleanly. With no grounds for any claim. She'll move to the next position. And you're... Marcus stopped, started again. You're okay with that? With her just moving on to someone else? What I'm okay with and what I'm going to do are not always the same question. A pause. The Aldercroft structure, Ethan said, is potentially an AML issue in Luxembourg. I've noted that to the file. I'm not going to act on it. That's not my jurisdiction and not my fight. He paused. But I'm going to send a courtesy notification to a contact I have at a particular international compliance consultancy who has relationships with the CSSF. Informally, not attributable to me, because I believe in the integrity of beneficial ownership disclosure frameworks. He could almost hear Marcus working out what that meant. You're going to get the Luxembourg regulator to look at their account, Marcus said. And I'm going to share information with a contact in the compliance field, Ethan said. What the contact does with it is outside my control. Another pause. The Dominic Ashford angle, Ethan said. FCA-regulated fund. Single institutional investor. If a U.S. court ever found that Ashford PE was connected to a fraudulent scheme to induce a contractual relationship, a marriage, for purposes of financial extraction, that finding would need to be reported to the FCA under their fit and proper person standards. Dominic would lose his authorization. The fund would be wound down. You're saying that even if you don't press charges? I'm saying the documentation I'm building is comprehensive and will be stored securely for an indefinite period. Should any future legal proceeding, civil or criminal, by any party, in any jurisdiction, call for relevant documentation regarding the Aldercroft structure, Greywell Consult, or the Ashford-Fenwick relationship, that documentation will be available. He paused. I'm not a prosecutor, I'm not a regulator, I'm a private citizen protecting my interests. But information properly documented has a long life. Marcus didn't say anything for a long time. Then, you thought about all of this in one afternoon. I think quickly when I need to, Ethan said. Ethan. Yes. She's been in your life for 14 months. Marcus. Right. Thank you, Ethan said, for coming. For telling me. You don't have to thank me. I know. He looked out the window. They were on the bridge now, the city laid out below them in its nighttime geography, lights on water, the geometry of towers. Get some sleep. We'll go to Gerald's Thursday. He ended the call. He held the phone in his hand for a moment. Then he looked at the city and thought, briefly, about the morning. About the gray bedroom. The dark hair on the pillow, the practiced closeness that he'd felt as warmth, and that had been, the whole time, a kind of weather. The shape of something that wasn't there. He thought about the pen. He put his phone away. The next 8 days operated on 2 levels simultaneously. On the surface level, Ethan Cole moved through his life in the ordinary way. He called Vivian on Thursday morning and kept the call brief, professional in its warmth, the voice of a man who was busy but present. He sent her a text on Friday with a photograph of a restaurant he'd passed that they'd been to once, accompanied by the kind of small, specific message that communicated, "I'm thinking of you in minor, continuous ways." He saw her on Saturday evening. Dinner at a place on the west side, 2 hours, unremarkable. The kind of evening that would leave no memorable edge in her mind. She was, as always, perfectly calibrated. She told him about a project she was working on. She described herself as a consultant, which was technically accurate in the way a key is technically a piece of metal. She told him about a trip she was thinking of taking to Lisbon in the spring. He listened. He asked appropriate questions. He ate his dinner. On the subsurface level, he was building the structure that would survive what came after. Theodore's draft, NJSA, arrived Thursday morning. Ethan read it twice, marked 3 points where the language needed sharpening, sent it back. Theodore revised and returned it Friday afternoon. It was clean. He and Marcus drove to Chestnut Hill Thursday evening. Gerald Cole lived in a house that had been built in 1927 and had not been substantially modified since, which gave it the quality of a period photograph. Heavy furniture, dark wood, the particular smell of a house that had been lived in continuously for decades by a person who changed nothing deliberately. Gerald himself was in the kitchen when they arrived, making tea, a small, white-haired man with a careful, slow quality of movement that spoke not of frailty, exactly, but of deliberateness, as if each motion was being performed with full awareness. He seemed genuinely pleased to see them both. They had tea. They talked about Marcus's work in Portland, about a tree in the back garden that Gerald had been monitoring for signs of disease, about a documentary Gerald had watched recently about the construction of the interstate highway system. Gerald had the quality of some elderly people, a kind of patient engagement, as if he had decided that conversation was worth his full attention in a way that it perhaps hadn't been when he was younger and always looking at the next thing. After dinner, Ethan said, "Gerald, I need to talk to you about the trust. Both of us do." Gerald looked at him across the table. "Walter's trust," Gerald said. "Yes." Gerald was quiet for a moment. He folded his hands on the table, large, bony hands, mapped with the geography of a long life. "I wondered," he said, "if you'd ever bring this up." Ethan looked at him. "You wondered." "I wondered what would happen when one of you got close to marrying." Gerald looked at both of them, moving his gaze between them with the measured pace of someone who was not in a hurry. "Your grandfather put that provision in with the best of intentions. He wanted to see his grandson settle down. He thought, the way men of his generation thought, that a family was the right occasion for inheritance." A pause. "I've thought, privately, over the years, that the language was a bit of an invitation to a particular kind of problem, a specific kind of woman who might find such a provision useful." Ethan said nothing. Marcus said, "You know about Vivian?" "I know nothing specific about any person," Gerald said carefully. "I know that Walter's provision was always an unusual one, and that in the current legal and social environment, the idea of wealth being accessible through marriage to a beneficiary was less benign than Walter intended." He looked at Ethan. "Am I correct in assuming that something has brought this concern to the front of your mind recently?" "Yes," Ethan said. "And am I correct that you're here to ask me to modify the trust?" "I've had Theodore Raines prepare a non-judicial settlement agreement," Ethan said. "It removes the qualified marriage event trigger entirely. The sole remaining distribution mechanism would be the trustee succession event, your death, Gerald, at which point the assets are distributed equally between Marcus and me, according to the existing instrument." Gerald absorbed this without apparent surprise. And both co-beneficiaries agree? He looked at Marcus. I agree, Marcus said. Gerald picked up his teacup, set it down, looked out the kitchen window at the dark garden. I would like Theodore to explain it to me directly, he said. Not because I don't trust you both, but because that's the right way to do it. I've already arranged for Theodore to speak with you, Ethan said. He'll call tomorrow morning. He'll also recommend that you engage your own independent counsel to review the document before you sign. Gerald looked at him for a long moment. You've thought about this carefully, Gerald said. Yes. This woman, Gerald said. Is she? Do you believe she had intentions toward the trust specifically? Ethan looked at his uncle. The white hair, the careful hands, the kitchen with its decades of accumulated quiet. Yes, he said. Gerald nodded once. The nod of a man who had heard exactly what he expected to hear and had already decided. I'll speak with Theodore in the morning, he said. I'll have my own man look at it by end of week. He stood slowly, with the deliberateness of someone managing a body that was no longer entirely cooperative. Now, does anyone want more tea? The NJSA was executed on the following Wednesday. All 3 signatures, notarized. Gerald's independent counsel, a Philadelphia estate attorney named Walsh, had reviewed the document and found it unambiguous and proper. A physician's attestation of Gerald's mental capacity, prepared 2 days earlier, was attached. Theodore filed the agreement with the surrogate's court that afternoon. The Colwood Irrevocable Trust now had exactly one distribution mechanism: the death of the trustee. The marriage trigger was gone. Ethan sat in Theodore's office after the filing and felt the specific quality of satisfaction that came not from winning dramatically, but from closing a vulnerability before it could be exploited, the satisfaction of a lock installed before the break-in rather than after. He called Marcus. It's done, he said. The trust? Filed this afternoon. Marcus breathed. And now? Now I end it, Ethan said. He called Vivian that evening. He asked if she could come over. There was something he wanted to talk about. She said, of course, the tone of her voice carrying a slight brightening, the kind that comes from a woman who has been building toward a specific moment and believes the moment may be arriving. She came at 7:30. She was wearing something simple, dark trousers, a cream blouse, and she had that quality she deployed for evenings she considered important: alert, present, the full weight of her attention aimed at him in the specific way that had always felt like being chosen, and now felt like being targeted. They sat in the living room. She had a glass of wine. He had water. He said, I want to be honest with you about something. She looked at him with the expression of someone who was ready to receive honesty and was positioning herself accordingly. I've been doing some thinking, he said, about us, about where this is going, and I've come to a decision. Ethan! I'm ending this, he said. The expression didn't collapse. She was too skilled for that. It reorganized. The warmth didn't vanish. It shifted, became something more careful, more watchful. A quality of assessment appeared in her eyes that was, in its way, more honest than anything she'd shown him in 14 months. Can I ask why? She said. I'm not going into specifics, he said. I've made the decision. I think it's the right one for both of us. He paused. I'll have your things sent to your apartment. There's not much. He looked at her. I'd like you to return the key. A silence. Something moved through her expression. Not grief, he thought, but calculation. The recalculation of a position that had just been revealed as untenable. He watched it happen. He watched her work through it. Is there someone else? She said. No. Did something happen? I made a decision, he said. It's not a conversation. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and set the apartment key on the coffee table between them. She picked up her wine, finished it, set the glass down. "All right," she said. She stood. He stood. She looked at him. And for one moment, the performance fell away entirely, or seemed to. She looked at him with something he couldn't fully categorize, not sadness, not anger, something cooler and more complex. The look of a person who has been playing a long game and has just heard the final move announced, and who is, beneath everything else, a professional. "You know," she said quietly. He said nothing. She picked up her bag. "You're very good," she said. She left. He stood in the living room for a moment after the door closed. He looked at the key on the coffee table. Small, ordinary, brass, attached to a black plastic fob with his building's logo on it. Though, he picked it up. He thought about 14 months. He thought about the pen. He thought about the cold coffee and the gray bedroom and the specific, practiced warmth of a person who had been, for over a year, performing the role of someone who loved him with the professional commitment of someone who loved the trust. He thought about his grandfather, who had put a marriage provision in a trust out of sentiment, and about the specific kind of patient intelligence that had found that provision and built an 18-month operation around it. He thought about Marcus, sitting in a bar in 2027 watching it happen. He put the key in his pocket. He went to his desk. He opened the draft complaint to the IRS Office of Professional Responsibility regarding Harold Holloway, enrolled agent. He read it once. He pressed send. The Holloway matter moved more quickly than he'd expected. The OPR acknowledged receipt within 48 hours. Ethan had attached the documentation he'd gathered, not the full file on Vivian and the Aldercroft structure, which he was holding separately, but the specific evidence of the Holloway disclosure. A chain of correspondence recovered through a source he'd retained. A payment record from a third-party account that he'd traced through standard forensic methods, and a statement from his own records demonstrating that the documents Holloway had disclosed contained information that had not been in any public filing. OPR investigations moved at their own pace, but the receipt of documentation of this quality, organized, cross-referenced, presented with the precision of a man who had spent 11 years doing exactly this kind of work, typically accelerated the timeline. Ethan didn't wait for the outcome. He moved on. The courtesy notification to his compliance contact regarding the Aldercroft structure and its beneficial ownership disclosure obligations under Luxembourg's AML framework went out the following Monday. He'd written it carefully, technically informed, jurisdiction-specific, presented as a good-faith notification from a professional who had encountered the structure in the course of work and had concerns about its compliance status. It named Cosimo Fenwick. It named the Luxembourg registration. It provided the corporate registry number. It did not name Vivian. It did not name Dominic Ashford directly. It didn't need to. Compliance investigators, like financial forensics specialists, were good at following chains. He received a brief acknowledgement from his contact 3 days later that simply said, "Received. Will be referred to appropriate team. Thank you for the information." He filed the acknowledgement in the folder. 2 weeks after the gallery, on a Thursday morning, Chao Wang, he was in his office reviewing documentation on a case, a mid-sized construction company whose CFO had been moving receivables through a series of phantom vendor accounts, a straightforward fraud that had been running for 3 years and was now unraveling with the specific structural inevitability of these things, when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. It read, "I underestimated you. That won't happen again." He looked at it. He thought for a moment. Then typed back, "I know." He put the phone face down on his desk. He went back to the construction company documentation. He called Marcus that evening. Not about anything specific. Marcus had flown back to Portland the previous week, after the trust execution, and their conversation had returned to its usual register. Comfortable, slightly spare. The communication of two people who didn't need to perform closeness because the closeness was structural. "How are you?" Marcus asked. "Working," Ethan said. "And the rest of it?" "Resolved." He was at the window. He was always at windows, he thought. A habit that would have meant something different to a different kind of person. To him, it was simply where he went when he needed to think in a direction that wasn't bounded by walls. "Gerald called me yesterday. Said Walsh reviewed the filed modification and has confirmed it's clean." "Good." A pause. "And Holloway?" "Pending. It'll move." "And the—" Marcus stopped. "The Luxembourg thing." "Also pending." Marcus was quiet. "You know," Marcus said, in the version I came from, after everything happened, you were so angry. Not at her specifically. Just at yourself for not seeing it." Ethan looked at the city. "I saw it," he said. "I saw it and chose not to look at it directly. That's a different thing." "Is it?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Anger at deception is easy. Anger at your own choice to be deceived is harder and more honest." He paused. "I made a choice to not look at the Geneva transfer. I had reasons for making that choice. Some of them were practical, some of them—" He stopped. "Ethan." "Some of them were not." Marcus said nothing, which was the right thing to say. "I'm not angry," Ethan said. "I'm very tired of being surprised by the lengths people will go to, but I'm not angry." "I know," Marcus said. They talked for another few minutes, about Gerald, about the Portland project Marcus was working on, point about Thanksgiving, and whether it would just be the two of them and Gerald this year, which seemed likely given the state of things. Then they said goodbye with the particular economy of brothers who have said everything that needed to be said and are now comfortable in the silence that follows. Ethan put the phone down. He stood at the window. Below him, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, persisting. Generating the ambient noise of a million unrelated purposes all operating simultaneously. Delivery trucks and late-night conversations and taxis and the particular hiss of tires on wet pavement that meant it had started to rain while he'd been on the call. He thought about what Marcus had said at the Meridian bar, the specific image of it, his brother sitting across from him with the controlled tension of someone who had been carrying something for a long time. "I was sitting in a bar in 2027. Watching my brother rebuild from zero at 44 years old. He thought about the version of himself that had existed in that other timeline. The version that had nodded and smiled and proposed and signed, and then watched everything come apart through discovery proceedings and FCA notifications and civil suits. The version that had not looked directly at the Geneva transfer. He thought about that version with something that wasn't quite sympathy and wasn't quite contempt. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a self that had made a different choice, that had chosen the warmth of an unexamined thing over the cold precision of knowing. He didn't make that choice. He'd made the other one. The city rain came down. He turned from the window. 3 weeks later, a man named Gerald Cole, 81 years old, resident of Chestnut Hill, trustee of the Coalwood Irrevocable Trust, died quietly in his home on a Saturday morning. In the way that some old men die, without drama, in his own bed, in the house he'd lived in for 40 years, with nothing left unresolved. Ethan received the call from Gerald's housekeeper at 9:14 a.m. He sat for a moment in his kitchen, in the morning light, with his coffee cup in his hand, and thought about his grandfather's brother, the white hair and the careful hands, and the kitchen with its decades of quiet, and the garden with its disease-threatened tree. He thought about the last time he'd seen him, at the trust signing, and the way Gerald had looked at him across the table, the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who had understood everything and needed nothing explained. He called Marcus. Marcus answered on the second ring. "Gerald died this morning," Ethan said. A silence. Not the silence of shock. Marcus had known, as they all had known, that this was coming. But the silence of arrival. Of something that has been expected for a long time finally completing its approach. Okay, Marcus said. His voice was thick for a moment. He cleared it. Okay? I'll call Walsh today, Ethan said. And Theodore. The trust administration will take 3 to 4 months, but the process is straightforward. He paused. The Lake Tahoe property. I was thinking about whether you'd want it sold or held. A pause. I'd like to keep it, Marcus said. If that works for you. I think so too, Ethan said. He looked out the kitchen window. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of October morning that had a specific quality of light, precise and shadowless, that made everything look like itself. The buildings, the sky, the particular bareness of trees beginning to lose their leaves. He drank his coffee. It was warm. He was back at work by Monday. The construction company CFO case was moving toward resolution. The fraud had been quantified at $4.2 million. The documentation was complete. The referral to the DA's office had been made, and Ethan's role as the forensic expert in the civil recovery proceeding would begin next month. He had 2 other cases in progress. He had a new client inquiry that Sienna had routed to him Friday, a mid-market pharmaceutical company that suspected a vendor was overbilling. He sat at his desk on Monday morning with a cup of coffee, warm, and the pharmaceutical inquiry in front of him, and he read it with the precise, trained attention that he brought to everything, the attention that read a financial document the way a clinician reads a chart, looking for what it said, what it didn't say, and what the gap between those 2 things told you. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. It was, when everything else was removed, the one consistent fact of his professional life, the one thing that had remained constant across 11 years and 40-some cases and all the various arrangements of his personal life, the ability to look at a stream of numbers and feel the shape of a deception inside it. He thought, briefly, about the pen, about the specific calibration of starting with something small enough not to register. He picked up his coffee. He opened the pharmaceutical file. He started working. There is a particular quality to the period after a long operation is dismantled, not the dramatic quality that cinema tends to assign to endings, but a quieter, more textural thing. Days that are simply days again, coffee that is just coffee, windows that are just windows. Ethan noted this quality without particular sentiment. He did not, in the weeks that followed, think often about Vivian, not in the way he thought other men might have thought about a woman who had been in their lives for 14 months, sleeping in their bed, drinking their coffee, moving through their apartment with the particular ease of someone who had settled into a space. He thought about her the way he thought about any case that had been resolved. Clinically, occasionally, in the context of what it had taught him. What it had taught him. That the tell, in any deception, was always in the proportion. That something calibrated to feel exactly right, in his experience, was more likely than something genuinely right to be calibrated. That the instinct he'd suppressed, the instinct that had seen the Geneva transfer and said wrong, and that he had overridden with a nod, was an instinct worth trusting. He filed this away. He did not attempt to date anyone in the immediate aftermath. This was not a deliberate policy, so simply an inclination that he didn't interfere with. He worked. He visited Gerald's grave in Chestnut Hill with Marcus in November, standing in the cold in front of the simple stone with their breath visible in the air, not saying much, in the way of men who don't need to say much. He worked on the trust administration with Theodore and Walsh. He attended the DA's presentation on the construction company case. He reviewed the pharmaceutical overbilling inquiry and found, within 2 days, a vendor relationship that involved a third-party intermediary whose sole function appeared to be the receipt of payments that were then routed back to an employee of the pharmaceutical company, a classic kickback structure, clean in the execution, but visible in the timing irregularities of the billing cycle, which no one had looked at closely enough. He was always looking closely enough. He got a call from Petra in December. "Thought you might want to know," she said. Aldercroft Meridian Holdings, the Luxembourg Foundation. CSSF has opened a preliminary inquiry into their beneficial ownership disclosure compliance. Nothing public yet, but it's in the system. "Noted," he said. "Also," she said with the professional nonchalance of someone who traded in information as a matter of daily life, "there's a FCA regulatory notice regarding Ashford Private Equity Holdings. Not an enforcement action. A request for information could be routine. Could be the beginning of something." "Thank you," Ethan said. He filed the note. The Holloway matter resolved in January. OPR found a violation of Circular 230, revoked Holloway's PTIN effective immediately, and referred the matter to the IRS's Civil Division for a penalty assessment. Holloway's attorney reached out to Ethan's attorney in February about a potential settlement of Ethan's civil claim, which Ethan's attorney communicated should begin at a number with 6 figures. He didn't think much about whether Holloway had been frightened of the process or simply calculating. It didn't matter. The outcome mattered. Marcus came to New York for Christmas, and they spent 3 days doing very little: cooking, watching films Ethan had never found time to see, walking through the city in the specific rhythm of 2 people who share an understanding that doesn't require constant verification. Marcus seemed better. Seemed not lighter exactly. His brother had always had a particular gravity to him, a quality of seriousness that Ethan had, over the years, sometimes wished he could remove, like a coat that was too heavy for the season. But there was something resolved in him. The tight quality from the bar at the Meridian was gone. On the last evening, they were at Ethan's kitchen table with a bottle of good wine and the remains of a meal, and Marcus said, "Do you think about her? About the other version? What it would have looked like?" Ethan considered this. "Sometimes," he said. "In the abstract. The way you think about any path not taken." He turned the wine glass slightly on the table. "I think about it the way I think about a case where we caught the fraud before the client suffered the loss. There's a particular quality to that, less dramatic than coming in afterward, but more useful." He paused. "The client doesn't feel it the same way, which is probably appropriate. The absence of harm is less memorable than harm." Marcus looked at him. "Are you okay?" Marcus said. Ethan looked up at him. His brother, 3 years younger, same dark hair with the wave at the temples, the settled quality that Ethan had always envied, and now, sitting here in December with the city outside quiet and the wine warm in his hand, simply recognized as a version of his own stillness wearing different features. "I'm fine," Ethan said. "I know you say that when you're Marcus." He met his eyes. "I'm fine, not fine as in don't ask. Fine as in I'm okay, things are okay." He paused. "It would be dishonest to say I felt nothing. It would also be dishonest to say that what I felt was commensurate with what was real, which it wasn't on either end." He looked at the wine glass. "I felt things about a version of her that didn't exist. The woman who handed me coffee and borrowed pens and told me about Lisbon. Sa. That version? I felt things about that version. And that version was a construction, so?" "So," Marcus said. "So what I'm grieving, if that's the word, is a fiction." He looked up. "Which is its own kind of thing. But it doesn't require the same treatment as grieving something real." Marcus was quiet. "The whole mechanism of it," Ethan said, "is calibrated to make the fiction feel real enough that the grief at losing it mirrors the grief at losing something genuine. It's one of the cruelties of the play. The damage is designed to persist even after the play fails." He paused. "I'm aware of the mechanism, that helps." "Does it?" "Enough," Ethan said. He poured more wine. Marcus stayed until New Year's Day. They watched the city ring in the new year from Ethan's window, the distant noise of it, the particular geometry of fireworks above the park. And Ethan thought briefly about what the new year would hold in the other timeline, the one Marcus carried inside him. He thought about what February would have looked like in that version, with a proposal pending and a pregnancy scare designed to precipitate it and the trust trigger ready to fire. He thought about it the way you think about a door you've closed, aware it exists, clear about why you closed it, not tempted to open it. He watched the fireworks. He went to bed. The Colwood Trust Administration closed in February. Theodore's final report was 12 pages and impeccable. The total distributable value of the trust at Gerald's death was $18.4 million in combined assets, plus the Lake Tahoe property at current appraisal. After administrative costs and tax obligations, the distributable value was approximately $17.1 million, split equally between the two co-beneficiaries. Marcus received confirmation of his share on a Thursday. He called Ethan, and the first thing he said was, "Dad would have had something to say about this." Ethan thought about their father, the meticulous man, the man who had wasted nothing and felt nothing about waste, and had still managed to die leaving debts, because the people around him had not been honest, and he had not looked closely enough at the ones who weren't. Who had said to his two sons, in ways that were never entirely articulate but were deeply felt, "Pay attention, look closely. Don't let the warmth of a thing substitute for the truth of it." "He would have," Ethan said. "He'd be proud of you," Marcus said. Ethan was quiet. "He would," Marcus said, "for what it's worth." Ethan looked out the window. The February city was gray and specific. The particular gray of late winter that had no warmth in it, that simply was what it was, without apology or modulation. He found this quality easier sometimes than the gold of October, less to navigate. "Go do something good with it," Ethan said. "Your share." "I have a few ideas," Marcus said. "I know you do." They talked for a few more minutes. Then Ethan ended the call and sat in his quiet office for a moment. The white and glass of it, Sienna's low keyboard sound from the outer room, the stack of case files on the credenza, the familiar architecture of his professional life, arranged around him in its clean, purposeful way. He had a call at 10. He had depositions Thursday in the construction company case. He had in the queue from Sienna 3 new client inquiries, one of which looked interesting. A family office that suspected an asset manager of performance manipulation. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the new inquiry. He opened it. 6 months after the gallery, on an unremarkable Wednesday in April, Ethan was walking back from a lunch meeting through Midtown when he saw, across the width of a busy intersection, a woman in a blue coat moving with the particular quality of purposeful movement that made her immediately readable as someone who always knew exactly where she was going. He recognized the set of the shoulders, the specific angle of the head. Vivian. He stood at the crossing and watched her move through the pedestrian flow on the opposite side. And then she was gone, absorbed into the crowd, vanished into the ordinary motion of the city, the way things vanish when you stop trying to track them. He stood there for a moment. The light changed. He crossed. He did not look for her. He was back in his office by 2. He hung up his coat, declined a call from a number he didn't recognize, and accepted a call from Petra, who had a brief update on a separate matter, and then, at the end, said, "Thought you should know. Aldercroft has been formally closed by the CSSF. Beneficial ownership violation. The assets are frozen pending an AML investigation." Ethan noted this. "Also," Petra said, with the same professional flatness, "the FCA has revoked Ashford PE's authorization, fit and proper finding. The fund is being wound down." A pause. "All right," Ethan said. "You don't seem surprised." I'm not. Were you? She paused. Were you the source on the CSSF notification? Ethan said nothing. Never mind, Petra said. Professional habit. Have a good week. Ethan. She hung up. Ethan set the phone down. He looked at the credenza, at the case files arranged there in their clean order. At the window beyond, where the April city was doing the thing it did in April, beginning, again, the laborious and beautiful process of becoming something slightly warmer than it had been. He pulled the asset manager performance manipulation inquiry in front of him. He uncapped a pen. He started reading.
Yeah, I need to take this off. No, I don't know. Oh God, my wife just came in here because she needed a ring light to bring to.
Uh-oh, the wife caught you wearing your costume.
This is.
Hey, tell her it's for Twitch, all right? It's for
She
Twitch.
knows. She knows, but I look like a fucking moron right now. She came in here.
So it's all open from the bottom. That's good. I thought it was like all closed off. I was gonna say, man, you do one gnarly ass fart in that motherfucker, and you're dead.
Yeah, no, but like my PCs are at my feet, and so like the heat from them are coming up and into the. It's warming up the wiener. But I don't know how much longer I can wear this. Ayo. Gotta vent through the arms.
All right, Tanner, I'm gonna practice my flying.
Okay. You do that.
Well, you can be my gunner.
I'll try.
If I can get in there. Bro, we had some sweaty ass fucking lobbies last night.
Yeah, I was watching Possess's VOD, and he was getting. Seemed like he was getting a little heated there.
This fucking match already started.
All call signs you are cleared to attack.
It's
Secure
not
the
too
open
late in the
gates and
game.
defend against any hostile acts. Move out.